and welcome to Framing Leadership. This is part two of my conversation with Meghan Rivera, who is the U.S. Market President for Organon. In this conversation, Meghan and I discuss how she builds cultures, how she builds cohesive leadership teams and the cultures that surround them. And then we also speak about the three personas of leadership, which is leaders are managers, there's leaders and their coaches, and Meghan's insight into each of these areas. So thanks for joining us on Framing Leadership.
So important. So important.
So when you think about unleashing that talent, right? One, collectively hiring the talent, forming that team where people are really working really cohesively together. How intentional are you around building the culture of a cohesive leadership team? Is that something you think about pretty consistently, and how you manage that?
Yeah, 1,000%. 1,000%. It's one of my top priorities as a leader of leaders has been to be super intentional about a culture and living and breathing that every day. I can throw values on a piece of paper. I can throw a bunch of inspirational quotes on a wall. Yeah. If we're not embodying that and creating the symbols of that as a leadership team, as a senior leadership team of an organization, we've got a problem. And so I firmly believe that culture takes a lot of work, of work. And I've been in organizations and in situations where I've built a culture from scratch, right? My last organization as a startup, we built a commercial org from the ground up.
Yeah, I would love to pick your brains about that little organization. Yeah. Right? It was the gamified, right? The gamified.
Yes.
Yeah, that looked really interesting. So,
yes.
Folks, we won't get into this right now with Meghan, but wow, I really want to pick your brain on that. But yeah, so your intentional, how intentionally you built that culture. Are there some steps that you and some ideas you could help leaders understand of how you kind of created a culture that really builds psychological safety and really untaps that potential that you've seen in those people?
Yeah. So I think a most recent example of that is as I came into the U.S. organization at Organon, and while we're a new company, we are made up of a cohort that comes from most of their careers at Merck, and then a cohort that comes from the outside. And so one of the things that was important to me in taking on this leadership team and beginning to evolve the culture was truly defining as a team what were the values that we found important that we were going to hold each other accountable to. Yeah. And those values and behaviors are things that we put down on paper. Yeah. And we sat in a room and put them down on paper, and every single quarter we take that piece of paper back out and we say, how are we doing?
That's awesome.
And it's not linear, right? So it's not, we don't have necessarily linear progress on all 5 of those behaviors that we defined, or 6 of those behaviors that we've defined. Some quarters were like, wow, we've really regressed over here. That's a problem. And we have that real conversation. And I think for me, one of the most important things, and something that I drove with that team and continue to really share, is that like, I appreciate authentic, direct dialogue. Yeah. There is absolutely nothing, I think, that builds more trust than being comfortable with being honest with each other. And understanding that this is like, everybody's rooted in good intentions. Like, we're just all trying to accomplish the same goal. We're doing it differently. But we've got to keep those lines of communication open and create a safe space for feedback and a safe space for really honest, sometimes challenging dialogue as a leadership team, if we want that to happen throughout the organization.
No, I love that. I don't know if you've read anything by Kim Scott, Radical Candor. She's the lady who wrote the book Radical Candor, but fascinating because you hit on those things. Like, I love the idea of how do we open up safe space where we can challenge the status quo and each other respectfully, but we have to have that ability to have radical candor with each other. It's not because we're looking at, I love the other thing you said is positive intentions. It's always built on positive intentions, doing the things right, finding the right way to get the job done, not my idea or somebody else's idea where we're playing favoritism, but the radical candor around saying, let's kind of get into it. Let's get a little messy, but at the end of the day, it's because we want to do what's right.
Yeah, 1,000%. Totally agree. Totally.
Yeah. The other thing you hit on is one of my favorite books. It's right back behind me. This side, actually, The Advantage by Patrick Lencioni. I don't know if but he talks a little bit, and you hit on this concept as well, which is fascinating. Is he always said, like, my first job was to build a cohesive leadership team, and to build a cohesive leadership team, you kind of talk about values, and what he talked about is how do we behave?
Yeah.
Not how does my company behave, but how do we as a leadership team behave? Because the way we behave is basically the way the rest of the organization will behave. If we behave poorly, if we don't have psychological safety, if we don't have radical candor, if we're not supporting and nurturing each other from a development standpoint, then nobody will, right? So how do you set that? And then how do we succeed? And then how do we communicate with one another? So I think that's fascinating that you hit on those things. I mean, you've been a leader for a long time. I'm not shocked at that, but just I think the learnings that I hear from reading books like Kim Scott, Radical Candor, the advantage. Sometimes I think people go like, Billingsley, you read too many books, but I read them because I love, when I talk to leaders like you, Meghan, you discuss those concepts and they become real for folks.
Yeah, absolutely. And it's so important. It's just and so much of it is learned over time too.
Yeah,
right? Like
absolutely.
I picked up a lot of things and a lot of theories, but situationally speaking, I mean, being in so many different situations where you're inheriting super experienced teams to building teams from the outside to kind of needing to overhaul, something in your career, whatever it is, there's so many situations that are thrown at you. And there's just some consistent things that I think once you can identify that there's a thread, things that have worked, it sticks with you for sure. So
one of the questions I sent you, it was actually the last question I sent you, but you're hitting on these concepts, is the concept, which I believe is really important, is stewardship.
Yeah.
The idea of stewardship. Can you because you're kind of talking about stewardship and what that means to an organization, but what does that mean to you as a leader, Meghan, and what ideas of stewardship do you have for other people who are becoming leaders?
Yeah, it's such a great question. And so stewardship, I mean, can mean so many things, right? I mean, we can be stewards of the values of the organization and ultimately carry those through behaviors in our leadership team. But if I think about stewardship, it probably parlays into what, the buzzword of servant leadership and such. And so to me, I just, I find it so important for my direct team, but also my extended team to really lean in and understand people as individuals. And what gets people out of bed in the morning? What's meaningful to them? Where do they want to be? What do they want to do? And so to me, I always say, and this is I'm sure my team at Organon would kind of chuckle if they hear me say this again, but I always say my goal as a leader of the U.S., as the leader of the U.S. market, is twofold. It's grow the people and grow the business. And I know that sounds silly and simple, but my goodness, if you invest in your talent, the business follows. It absolutely is true. And so to me, I am a champion for everybody who sits on my team, on my leadership team. I will continue to advocate for them, whether they're in the room or not, in all ways, and support what they're trying to do. And I do firmly believe that it's the golden rule principle. Gosh, like that's something that everybody wants for themselves, and it's something that we should be doing for our teams. It's really, really valuable.
Yeah, that's awesome. Well, thanks for that. Yeah. I always felt like stewardship, and you kind of articulated beautifully, is I love this quote that as a steward, I'm a caretaker, not an owner.
Yeah.
My mindset is around, to your point, developing my people. My people then develop the business, right? They are the ones who take care of the business. I have to make sure that I'm steering, they have the right vision. They understand what we need to do from an execution standpoint and why we need to do it, and how we need to do it in terms of the way we execute, the way we hold ourselves to ethics and integrity and compliance, things of that nature. So yeah, I love that mindset around being a caretaker, not an owner, because I believe sometimes people who feel like they own something and you have not articulated that their mindset is, I own it, so I'm going to make the decision. Where you kind of feel like, hey, I'm a caretaker. I'm going to build my people. My people are going to, if we're together, we're going to take care of this company. We're going to move it forward. We're going to build the best company we can. And I think that's why I love the mindset of stewardship. And you can see when companies have it and when you can see when companies don't, right? Because usually it's about the person instead of about caretaking and making that company better than it was the day you set foot.
100%. It's so true, Todd. And I think there's, I always joke with my teams that like, you'll never find somebody who I have zero desire to micromanage anything. I do not.
Yeah.
I do not want to get in your business unless,
Right.
I have to say, like, I start from, I was talking about this the other day with somebody. There are people who start from a place of trust.
Yeah.
There are people who start from a place of, you need to earn my trust. And
Right.
I think I happen to fall in the camp, good or bad, where it's, I come out of the gates trusting, and you have to give me a reason not to trust.
Yeah.
And I think that, just again, back to the principle of trust, especially if we're talking about stewardship and everything else, like, you have to be willing to put yourself out there and trust that you've got, you've got a leadership team, you've got individuals, you've got, an organization that can deliver. And it's your job as a leader to really just harness the power of that and clear that path for them to make it happen.
That's awesome. That's awesome. Thank you. So we talked a little bit about this in our back and forth emails to each other, is around that we believe that there's we framework leadership, and the work that I've studied for quite a long time with Rich Barron, who you know quite well, is we believe there's three personas of leaders, right? There are managers, there's leaders, and there's coaches. And then I think we always heard management development. We're going to go into management development. And when we were at BI, we were like, management's fine, but really what the world needs is better leaders, and they need better coaches. So how do we ditched management development. We said leader development. And then we spent a ton of time on helping people understand what leadership and coaching is all about. But the manager part is important too, right? You have to manage process, make sure that people are doing the right things from a compliance standpoint and from an expense reporting standpoint, and getting the budgets in correctly and making sure that the reports are right. So we're not trying to discount the role of management, but when you think about three personas of a leader: manager, leader, coach, do you like that thought process? And then how would you differentiate those three personas from a overall leadership standpoint?
I think, well, yeah, I do agree with the three buckets, so to speak, or the categories of leaders, right? From a management perspective, to your point, there's a day-to-day that needs to be executed upon, right? And I think that that should not be discounted by any means. I think that is the responsibility of, I would argue, everybody in the organization.
Yeah, I would agree. Stuff it's like every day, right? Getting out, brushing your teeth, taking a shower, making yourself presentable. It's just, that's kind of the
table stakes.
The management process. You manage process and you lead people.
Yep, exactly. And I think, to your point, leading people is the second piece, right? So, and I think that leading people can come in more formats than just being an actual on paper leader. I find the whole concept of leading with or without authority really, really important. I mean, it's about being an influential communicator. It's about building trust with stakeholders across your organization. It's about so many things. And so from a leader perspective, I think leadership goes beyond just your direct management of individuals on a team, but also goes to the examples you're setting across the org. And this kind of goes back to what I was saying earlier about the leadership team articulating behaviors and then showing up with those every single day. That's what makes you a leader, right? Taking us to the next level and doing a lot of those things, setting that vision and showing people how we're going to get there. And then I think coach is probably not as universally appreciated maybe by everybody, or maybe that's an inaccurate statement. Maybe it's more so, not that it's not appreciated, but it's harder to do for people.
That's well, I'll tell you, there's a lot of data that's come out. There's a company called PDG that works a lot within our industry. And then there's Gallup. Of course, Gallup has done the engagement survey for years, and McKinsey and Boston Consulting. So they've actually shown that leaders spend somewhere around only 10% of their time coaching. 10%. Does that surprise you?
I wish it did. It disappoints me. It doesn't surprise me.
Talk to me about disappointing you.
So this is something I've just noticed over time, regardless of the level of leader. It doesn't seem like people can get more comfortable with giving direct feedback. And I think that in order to be a really effective coach and to be willing to spend the appropriate amount of time on that, you have to be willing to lean in and have some conversations that aren't going to be comfortable.
Yeah.
And it's for the greater good.
Yeah.
But it's sometimes, I think, something that people maybe subconsciously avoid because it's not always the easiest thing to do. And that's across the board, right? I mean, you can have a top performer within your organization and have to give them difficult feedback, and you're going to avoid it. Because gosh forbid, do you want to give a top performer some tough feedback and that demotivates them?
Right. Exactly. Yeah.
I think it's a matter of just people just like getting to a place where they are effective coaches. And if we could get folks who manage people to a place where they are effective coaches, it would just become a lot easier. And I think that there's ways to deliver feedback that just that are just way more efficient, effective, comfortable, et cetera, that just work. So I guess, yeah, I'm disappointed in that stat, but I'm not surprised. I think also the pressing nature of like managing from quarter to quarter, or, you know, from quota to quota, you get to a place where it's like, if you had 1 minute where you're going to spend it and it's something that's going to pay what you believe is going to pay off very quickly,
right,
versus something that's a longer term investment. So if you pivot into that short-sighted kind of headspace, which many of us do when we're facing a short,
you got a lot of stuff coming down at you, man.
Yeah, then that's just something that's gonna like something that's gonna go on the back burner. Like I can invest in that tomorrow because the payoff is downstream, right? Versus going into manager mode, managing a process or something that's happening.
Looking at the numbers are the tail's wagging the dog instead of the dog wagging the tail.
Right? Like to be a coach is much less quantitatively tangible.
Yeah.
And so conceptually speaking, sometimes I think maybe harder for us to process the requirement of investment and what we would see pay off in the long term.
Yeah. I think two things that you hit on. One is earlier positive intent, right? If I'm coaching you, I'm going to coach you because there's positive intent. I want you to get better. And I think you have opportunities to, I was talking to one leader and he said, you know, my role as a leader is not only to run the organization, but build other leaders who take my space eventually.
Yeah.
And how do you do that if you don't coach somebody? I can't just fill you full of vision, but don't help you understand how to coach. How do I effectively build the skills and behaviors necessary for you to lead? And then you talked a little bit about stewardship, right? We talked about stewardship. I don't think you can be an effective steward if you're not consistently coaching people, right? Because you mentioned your leadership team has, you know, you've talked about what you value. And then you also look at a big organization like you're running, one that's coming together, one that's hitting its numbers, people. So that's beautiful as well. But you know that there's skills and behaviors that have to be executed by your people in the field and your leaders. And those are the things too that I think if we consistently think about what are the skills and behaviors do we need to be successful now, then boy, there's a lot coming at you as a leader. Artificial intelligence, machine learning, all this other stuff that's hitting on, then what do they need to be good at as this stuff starts to hit? I always go back to Rita McGrath's book around seeing around corners. How do we as leaders look at the skills they have now, but look at the skills they need in the future? Yep. And to me, that's where coaching comes into. If we're not spending that time really coaching our folks around those skills and behaviors that are necessary to be great now, but need to be great in the future, then am I being a good steward for my organization? And am I setting my team up for success? You know what I mean?
1,000%. And that's the interesting piece too, is that I think as coaches, like as leaders that are coaches, and as we think about growing people into increasing leadership roles within the organization, as I look across the board at, you know, potential succession plans for me, right? Like nobody's gonna do my current job like I do it.
Right.
I operate in a very unique to me way. It's something that, you know, I've always said, like I'm my true self, whether you guys like it or not. So
that's a beautiful thing.
That appreciates that, because there are probably some orgs that may not. But so everybody's going to bring that kind of authenticity to the table and going to bring a lot of their strengths to the table. And so for me as a coach, a leader coach, it's understanding what some of these individual strengths are and how do you harness those to be able to operate in a position at that next level of leadership. It may not look like the person who did it before you, but it needs to be as effective, if not more effective. And how do we work together to get you to a place where you feel comfortable that that's feasible, right? I think that's really important.
Yeah, that's awesome. Good. When you